Hello and welcome to the video. Within this video guide I will be sharing my very tried and tested recipe and methods for brewing my Hazy Pale Ale, which is also very juicy, so as such is aptly named being juicy and hazy pale ale. Unlike some recipes of this type, this one does not contain or need lactose, which is certainly a big win for those that are lactose intolerant or that simply dislike the taste. So let's get to it. As always, I will take you through the steps in order, and here is a sneak preview of my recipe's vital statistics. This recipe offers an approximation of 5% ABV and offers a very refreshing hazy pale ale that is also juicy, that is perfect as an easy drinking sessionable thirst quencher all year round. Like all of the tried and tested recipes that I share, this is written by me and can be found in full within the video's description, which is underneath the video window when viewed on a desktop computer. As always, I have worked very hard on this recipe to get it into the best state possible, and of course is very tried and tested, so you can brew this with confidence. You will also find a link to the full recipe on Brewfather, which can be used free of charge with some restrictions. For the very best results, and so you're actually brewing the recipe as intended, I strongly suggest that your initial steps will be to convert the recipe before ordering in your ingredients. I have an easy guide to doing this with Brewfather on my channel as shown on screen now, but the principles are pretty much the same for any other recipe calculator that you may use. Within this video guide, this recipe is being brewed using a Grainfather G40 to 20 litres, or approximately 5.28 US liquid gallons. Naturally, you can make your own choices here, and as part of the conversion process, this recipe can be scaled and shaped to suit your own brewing system and volume requirements. In terms of your brewing water, I suggest using a New England IPA water schedule, as after all the Hazy Pale Ale is essentially the smaller brother of the New England IPA. This is the water profile I've used during this recipe's development, and it has certainly worked very well. If you are very new to brewing, then you will be forgiven for skipping this step, but frankly it is something that I would encourage you to move towards as soon as possible, especially if you are a Brewfather user, as it makes the water addition side really easy. Moving on to the brew now, and I've started by adding water that is preheated to my first mash step temperature, and I am now gradually adding in grain into the brewing system to prepare for the mash. There are some very important aspects to this. Firstly, add your grain gradually and stir it in as you go, ensuring that every grain is wet. The first part of the brew is in many ways the most important, because lazy or sloppy methods at this point will impact the rest of your brew. An experienced brewer will always spend time as he or she prepares the mash in the way that you see me doing now, as frankly we've all made those early mistakes before and are determined to ensure a valid result. Moving on to the actual mash now, and shown on screen are the details of the mash schedule in both metric and imperial measurements. As you will note, this mashing temperature is a little higher than your average beer, as we do not wish this style of beer to end up as dry. This mash out temperature is fairly standard and will stop enzymic activity, and will also ready the grain bed for an easier sparge later on. Let's now look at the grain bill for this recipe. At 37.5% each, we have two base malts for this brew that are Morris Otter and Pilsner Malt. The Morris Otter will contribute some extra nutty and malty flavour compared to a regular pale ale malt, and will also add in some extra body, whereas the Pilsner Malt is very clean and crisp. Having a combination of the two makes for a best of both worlds base malt, which is very popular. Then at 15% of our grist we have a wheat malt, which at this level will add in some extra chewiness to the beer. We'll also add in a signature haze associated with this style. Then finally at 10% of our grist we have oats, which will add in smoothness to the mouthfeel and will contribute to the body. This adds to the juicy aspect of this recipe and contributes some haze too. Right after the mash, it is then time to sparge. This begins with lifting the graze basket up onto the system and then setting the system to a temperature close to boiling point. Then as I am sparging and while the grain bed is filtering through the sparge water, the system is ramping up in temperature. This saves some time and has no adverse effects. I always sparge gradually and evenly by hand to properly rinse out the sugars still caught in the grain bed. After the sparge, I then let the system top up fully with sparge water before then selecting boil temperature. The Grainfather system was then quickly at the point you see it at now, where a head of protein had collected. The wheat within this recipe certainly adds to this, and it is important to give this a good stir in to allow this to drop to protect yourself against the risk of a boil over. This is something to manage throughout the boil, though the main work in this regard will be at the start of the boil when most of the protein will show itself. Let's now look at the boil schedule. As you can see, this recipe uses the modern 30-minute boil, which not only saves you time, but more importantly boils off less flavour. In terms of hops here within the boil, we have two additions of two different hops, Mosaic and Eclipse. The collective profile offered here is one that consists of citrus tropical fruit, mango, blueberry, mandarin, pine and sweet fruit, as well as having a nice desirable juicy profile. This is a hop combination that I especially enjoy personally, and it is no surprise that it is a popular one. Be very sure that when you add your hops, be they pellets or cones, that you give them a very good stir in. This allows the hop oils to be released quickly as intended by the recipe. After the boil and cooling, it was time for the transfer of the wort into our fermenter and the addition of our yeast. For this brew I'm using 8-dram Craig from Craig Yeastery, which adds in some extra interesting flavours as well as making fermentation and conditioning really fast. For full details of this Craig, then please consult my 8-dram Craig video. If you cannot obtain this one, then feel free to use one that you can obtain, or if you like a regular type of yeast that will suit Pale Ale, it will all work essentially. However, I do really enjoy the results from 8-dram with this brew, so if you can, go for it. For this fermentation with this yeast, I use a temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, which is the equivalent of 95 degrees Fahrenheit. On this basis, fermentation was over in just under 2 whole days, though I did keep it in the fermenter for 7 days in total before transfer into a corny keg. This short but extra time in the fermenter with Craig gives it some great enhanced conditioning time as it is in bulk. Once your fermentation has reached the point of having just 5 to 10 gravity points left, I would recommend that you then add in your dry hops. I suggest that you have a maximum contact time of 5 days, but 3 days is actually plenty enough. I have tried all methods of dry hopping, but frankly nothing so far has had as good results, and there is no need to buy a book either. The very most important thing here is to keep things clean and sanitary, so here is a guide to doing that in a way that has never failed me so far in hundreds of brews. In this example I'm going to use a hop sock, but the procedure is similar with other container types. This starts with boiling the bag. I strongly recommend doing this no matter if the bag has been previously used and cleaned or if it's a brand new one straight out of the packaging. I then add this bag into a clean container and add sanitizer as a further safeguard. This will be the same container that I used to load the hops into. After this point I then wash and sanitize my hands, and this is repeated if I need to touch the bag after touching anything that is not clean and sanitary. These are very important steps to avoid contamination, which is all too common when it comes to homebrewers making IPAs because of this step. I then carefully add the dry hops with the bag lining the container, being sure that nothing touches the bag except for the hops. Once you have loaded all of your hops into the bag, then be sure to tie a nice strong knot to keep all of the hops contained. This loosely fitting hop bag, so there is room to expand, can now be added into your fermenter. Let's now take a look at the end beer from this brew alongside my tasting notes. You can see that the pour is very light, and that once in the glass the end beer is a nice golden amber with a pure white head. I especially appreciate a nice frothy head on my beers, and my setup is made with this in mind. This beer has been under 12 psi of pressure, which is 0.83 bars, and I'm also using this pressure for serving too. The beer you see here is at around the 2 week point from kegging, but this one is ready to drink as soon as you carbonate it, and I totally advocate drinking it as fresh as possible. I would suggest a drinking temperature between 7 to 10 Celsius, which is the equivalent of approximately between 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures lower than this will simply hide flavour. Here are my tasting notes at this 2 week point as follows. Aroma. The aroma found here is very much one of fresh tropical fruit, along with plenty of citrus. Flavour. This one is very easy and silky smooth on entry, and you will very quickly hit the juicy character of this recipe, which is very tropical with an underlying fresh citrus backing. You will also note blueberry and sweet fruit before a soft bitterness on the finish. Many have perceived this beer as something stronger than 5% in keeping with a full New England IPA, which was one of the primary goals for this recipe. I note that despite the lack of lactose, this recipe stays on track to style in that it has a medium body and acceptable levels of sweetness, along with a soft bitterness. I did various trial versions of this recipe with small amounts of lactose, but in blind tasting most people preferred the version without lactose, so the choice of not using lactose was an enhancement rather than a compromise. My final impression here is that this is a juicy and fruity hazy pale ale that offers a variety of refreshing fruit flavours without the need for lactose or a high ABV to be refreshing and satisfying. So now you have all of the details. I would love to hear from you once you have brewed this and have given it a tasting yourself within the comments section of this video. I do hope that you found this video useful, informative and interesting. If so, why not consider liking and subscribing? For further support you can join the channel's Facebook group, and if you would like to support the channel then check out the channel's merchandise store, as all profits go back into the channel. Until next time, happy brewing!